So the Battle of the Somme, why? What's the big picture here? During the summer of 1916, the Allies, a very loose term because it wasn't an official alliance, but Haig had decided this was going to be a year to push the Germans out of France. Remember, when the war finished, the German army was still in France and Flanders. And this was planned for a long time. We've got the new army coming on stream, having replaced the volunteers that had fallen and the regulars that had gone the same way. But what happened, the event that put Haig off his game was Verdun, when the Germans decided they were going to make a stand at Verdun, attack Verdun, and draw all the French army there, then draw all the British reserves to get, hoping that they'll come to rescue the French army, and to bleed them white. Was when you read the German orders and it says the object is to bleed the enemy white, you begin to realise why we all have the attitude perhaps we obtained at school towards the First World War. So the German intention was to destroy the French reserves and the British relief at Verdun. So the offensive plans at Somme were adjusted so that it would fall on the British army more so than the French army. The original plan was to use both armies, but this meant that more emphasis was placed on the British army. And by the end of May, a very wise man, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Robertson, who tried to keep the politicians off Haig's back because he understood that politicians were not soldiers, he warned Haig about raising expectations of having this breakthrough in 1916, because like most professional soldiers, Haig included, many of the regular soldiers and regular officers knew that this war was going to carry on for some time, and with tremendous loss of life, because there was no answer to the technology being unleashed in Flanders. Contrast that with the Second World War, where Britain's empire had a quarter of the casualties in something that was 10 times, 100 times the size in some theatres, because the Western Allies chose to use technology rather than men. And that was a lesson, that was one of the lessons that came from the First World War. So very quickly you can see on the map the Somme area, the Somme Valley, and Verdun. So we now have the French armies having to concentrate on Verdun, and it's leaving the British sector more responsible for what's about to take place for this assault. And you now are beginning to view the Somme as being a way of relieving the pressure on the French army at Verdun. So it's not just about a breakthrough, it's about saving an ally, because Verdun was horrendous. An awful expression you hear today is meat grinder. I hate the expression, but I can't think of a better one to describe Verdun. And we'll see that when we see the results of this campaign at the end. So the British army is disposed along there. We have the 5th Army, which is in reserve, Allenby's 3rd Army at the top, German armies opposing. These are huge, massive formations. 4.5 million men from Britain and the Empire passed through the army and under Haig's command during the war, and at any one time he had 1.5 million men. What is it now, 70,000? Yeah. So they created an army for this, and a thruster. You always think this is a thruster. Anybody that shows any energy is called a thruster. General Rawlinson, he was going to have to use these new army soldiers, and researchers showed that they needed more and more training. We're at a stage where these are all volunteers. Conscription only came out in April 1916, so there were no conscripted soldiers at the Somme. They're still in their depots at home and in the recruiting offices. When you look at the training required to undertake this offensive, massive amount of training, but out of the 4 months put aside for preparation, only 1 week was actually devoted to infantry training, because what they were doing was digging and building, laying railways and everything else. That's what engineers are for. But no, you need hundreds of thousands of men on this job, and the infantry did it. So they were not properly prepared. I just put some of the, you recognise some of these faces, I'll skip through them. And here we are, this infantry, instead of training how to advance across open ground under cover of an artillery barrage, smoke and everything else, they're spending nearly all their time digging. to run the battle, Haig decentralised his commander. He didn't believe he could overrule his army commanders. He would give them the general policy. And what happened was that there was a conflict between or contradiction between Haig and Rawlinson, because Rawlinson realised with the resources he had available, he could only attempt buy and hold. In other words, seize limited objectives, consolidate, and then prepare to move on. As it turned out, very prescient. When I first came across this about 30 years ago, I was very impressed with Rawlinson. I thought his thinking was great. But Haig was still pressing for the big breakthrough so we could get the cavalry in and put the Germans back behind the Rhine or back behind the French border, and also relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun. The artillery resources were mismatched to requirements. Huge resources, but not enough, as it turned out to be. But then this is the first time this type of approach to a campaign is being used. This is unique. It's easy to criticise, but if this is the first time you face this problem, and do bear in mind that Haig wrote all the manuals for the army in the years leading up to the First World War. The cavalry manual, the infantry manual. He was a professional soldier. When he was a younger officer, he was a bit reticent and detached anyway, but because he studied and he wrote and he researched and he published articles and did theory, a lot of his fellow officers had nothing to do with it, because he should have been out enjoying himself. Nothing wrong with enjoying yourself, but it's a serious business. But whatever happened, the effect of this sort of mismatch is there was a loss of surprise, and bearing in mind the Germans dug trenches to hold ground. Germany knew it would have to stay static on the Western Front because it's fighting on the Eastern Front as well. And only when that Eastern Front had been sorted out could they then attack further in the West. They got caught between these two stools. Whereas you look at Allied trenches, I don't know how many of you have seen trenches in France, they're relatively light construction, they flood and everything else, because they were meant to be temporary platforms from which the Allied army was going to rush the enemy. So all of a sudden, when you break it down, you can see where you get a loss of surprise, you get compromise and confusion. Never a good recipe for going into action. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I looked at the two infantry regiments. I live in Bearsted near Maidstone, and I used to, until August, I was teaching in Canterbury, so got a foot in both camps. I looked at the service battalion. Service battalions are manned by Kitchener's army, so a service battalion would be the volunteers that were raised from 1914 to 1916. They were formed in Canterbury, August 1914. They arrived in France, June 1915, so 10 months later they're fully trained, equipped, and they're shipped to France. They saw action in the Battle of Loos, September 1915, and then the next time they were in action was the following July at the Battle of Albert. Training. For many of these soldiers, it was that digging rather than the training. Although at this time, Haig was beginning to develop the rotation system, whereby you only served 4 days at the front, then back in the reserve trench, then in the second reserve trench, then you went back for rest and recreation. That system hadn't been fully refined by the time of the Somme. It came afterwards. But it is noticeable that compared to the French, who put their infantry in one position, they stayed there. So if they were in an area that was going to see action, they get it. And if they were in an area that didn't see any action, they didn't get any action. And their morale suffered as a result. Haig was very proactive in the welfare and looking after, but he could do nothing about the scale of the casualties that these weapons are going to be inflicting upon people trying to cross open ground. You can't escape from that. They started, the war diary shows, they started the Battle of Albert with 39 officers and 1,050 other ranks. Between the 1st of July, of course, was the day in which the offensive started. Over the first 3 days, they lost 11 officers and 263 other ranks. And then they were almost immediately back in action further on at Le Posier and Le Transloy. and they were in action for several weeks, this battalion. And you can see from their war diary, 1st of July 1100, they're not in the first wave. Message received, first objectives have been achieved all along the whole line. Hay was ecstatic. The first reports he got from along the line were saying, you know, everybody's achieving or well on the way to achieving their objectives. By 1830, they'd got to a line north of Albert, and then they had to return to their original trenches on the 2100 on the 2nd of July. So on the 3rd of July, early in the morning, 0300, only 7 hours later, they mount an attack on Villiers. A company went over by platoons. First wave, few casualties. Second and third waves caught in no man's land. Survivors bombed, grenades, German dugouts until the bombs exhausted. Second Lieutenant Farmer led survivors back to our lines. So you go, in a few lines, you go from first objectives have been achieved. This is going to be back to a backwards and forwards battle with sustaining heavy casualties. Palmer was an interesting character. Originally from Essex, which has a great view of Kent. Arrived in France, Isle of Grain, you can't beat it. Right. Arrived in France 3rd of November as a private in the 13th London Regiment. He was commissioned into the Buffs. It was quite normal to commission soldiers from the ranks into another unit. Sometimes the theory is that it's because you don't want to become an officer of your mates, but by this time, the scale of casualties in France, it's because you go where you're needed. It's why you end up with all these Highland and Welsh villages having nearly their entire manhood wiped out in battles. So you end up with all these Londoners like me, all ending up in the Highlanders and all the rest of it. It's all completely mixed. That number, that effect, it destroys the territory-based cohesion of the army, the traditional army, and shows how the First World War transformed everything for the army. He was awarded a Military Cross for his action. When his bombs were exhausted, he covered the withdrawal of his company with rifle fire and was the last man to leave the enemy trench in the action described on the previous slide. He was exhausted. He resigned his commission 26th of July 1918. Served in the ranks and then survived the war. The West Kents, again, 7th Service Battalion was formed in Maidstone 5th of September 1914, landed in France July 1915, similar timescale to the other unit. It attacked Montauban on the first day of the battle, 1st of July 1916. And it was still in action in September when it had to attack a major German position at the Schwaben Redoubt. I don't know if anybody have been there. It's still a formidable obstacle. It was involved throughout the battle from the 1st of July till when the battle sort of officially finished, petered out on the 18th of November. Of course, and quite rightly, focus is placed on the 1st of July, 20,000 men killed in one day. Right? The French had lost 26,000 in August, on one day, I think 22nd of August 1914. And it's always worth remembering that the French army lost more men by Christmas 1914 than the whole of the British Empire in the whole of the war. And until recently, the French population is the only one that hasn't recovered from the war, from the First World War. When you look at the demographic study, very sobering thought, an absolute measure of consequences of war. On the Somme, they lost 44 officers and 1,263 other ranks. This battalion becomes one of those that there's nobody in it at the end who was in it at the beginning. And sometimes some units, they replace 2 or 3 times. So you have a full strength battalion, roughly 1,000 men. It may be 3,000 men serving it during the war. Something that really brings you up short when you're looking through the records and trying to find people. Company Sergeant Major George Pearson. He was born in Ashford. So why he went to West, I don't know. But he born in action. He'd been a regular soldier for a long time. He held the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He was killed in action on the opening day. But when I was looking at the records, the thing that struck me was his age. And in the grounds of St Martin's Church at Canterbury, you can see there's a couple of soldiers there in their 60s, infantrymen in their 60s. Quite rightly, we know about the boy soldiers. The youngest one at the Somme was 14. I was in the Merchant Navy, and Merchant Navy boys, aged 13 and 14, hundreds were killed, you know, during the war. But it struck me, I suppose because I'm not getting any younger. And all of a sudden, well, 50 is quite young, but 50 years of age. What the hell is a 50-year-old then doing running around with a rifle and pack with this lot? You know, it's one of those things that makes you stop and think. Okay, so in their war diary, you've got the attack on Montauban. A battalion received a message 0812 that all appeared to be going well, but that the leading battalions had met with more opposition than expected and had suffered considerable casualties. So they're getting a slightly more nuanced message than the others. But of course it's a very broad front. Communications aren't brilliant. Around 1000, the battalion was called to support the 7th Surreys and 7th Buffs. And it's quite usual for neighbouring counties to be brigaded together as part of this identity in the army. A, B and C companies were sent orders to advance, but the runner carrying the message for D Company was knocked out. So D Company just sat on its backside because it received no orders, because no orders were able to get to it. There were heavy officer casualties, and this meant that the Company Sergeant Major Klein, he had to reorganise A Company and take command. The 7 Royal West Kents consolidate Montauban position, which was held under German shell fire by a battalion until the 4th of July, by which time they're running out of ammunition and the German attack is getting stronger. Okay, so some of these pictures haven't come out too well, but I wanted to give a general, you know, up to the grim faces you see. These are stage photographs, but illustrating the action. And this famous photograph of the faces at the end of it, people that have survived. My goodness me, you can't imagine it. The price paid was at the Somme over the months until November, 450,000 casualties. Germans 420, and the French, whose effort on the Somme had been reduced because of Verdun, still lost 200,000 on the Somme. And in Verdun, the French lost 380,000, and the Germans 340,000. That's 750,000 German casualties, and almost the same French casualties in these pivotal campaigns in 1916. The figures I mentioned earlier about the casualties, the largest casualties in a single day of killed. One of the things we always learn about how awful it was in the trenches, but the trenches were safer than running about on the field. And at the stages of the mobile war, the French casualty rate was at its highest before the trenches were dug, and they were the war of manoeuvre and the race to the sea. Similarly, for the British Army, in the 100 days to victory in 1918, and I do call it a victory, there's a book by Gary Sheffield called Forgotten Victory. Do please read it, because although the war was finished by an armistice with consequences to come 20 years later, the actual achievements of the British Army in 1918 were considerable, but the casualty rate was very high in this last phase of mobile warfare. And as a reminder of this, casualty rates in the breakout from Normandy in 1944 were higher than the rates through the First World War, especially amongst senior NCOs and junior officers at a time when the British Army was shrinking. So you have to sometimes Go away from the plans and the diagrams and the photos and think, what's it like as an infantryman? You're always going to be the first one round the corner. Who's going to be the first one over the field? Who's going to be the first one into that ditch? And you get, it's going to be the officer and he's going to be shot. It's quite harrowing when you think about it on a personal level. Casualties in 100 days to victory. British had 298,000 from 1.8 million. French 279,000 from 2.5 million. And the USA 130,000 from 1.9 million. These are substantial, and the Germans paid a higher price. Okay, I'm going to move on from that one, because what I want, my conclusion on this innocent lost is based on the following. What the Somme demonstrated was the reliability of the British Army. The French Army could rely on the British Army, the Allies, and the Germans could rely on the British Army not giving up. They put that to the test in April 1918 in the Kaiserslaut, 21st of March, when they almost broke through the gap between the British Army and the French Army. If they'd have got through that gap, and they were only 4 miles from doing so, then the British Army would have had to retreat and be evacuated. But that same effort took all the stuffing out of the German army and allowed the British Empire Army to advance in the north and the French in the south. The reality of attrition. This is war by attrition, not spectacular manoeuvre and attack, and you know, this is fighting to the death, to the last man standing. I've seen a letter from the King's private secretary trying to get he'd been persuaded by Haig to try to get the Prime Minister to appreciate that attrition is a valid method of war and that the public should be informed about it. This is what's happening to your sons. People are sitting down at their breakfast every day with the Daily Herald or the Times, and they've all got those black sheets and thousands of names of the dead are at their breakfast table. They showed the Somme, the first film shown to mass audiences with real dead bodies, and showing what it was like at the front. It brought it home to the people. These daily death lists across the newspaper, conscription has come in, total war's come in with industry, with farming and everything else. And it shows that the public accepted that this war is going to be fought to the end. We're not going to stop it because of the horrors of the Somme. We're going to have more of this in order to win. And sometimes that argument about the First World War is a little bit lost because of the moral arguments used to justify the Second World War. In fact, the moral argument in the First World War is exactly the same. Do you want to live under law and order and freedom, or do you want to give in? It's the same choice people faced. And I've been impressed by the public acceptance. You know, the public can't be taken for fools. Right? So we end up with conscription and total war, which is why I say the Somme, the terrible campaign of the Somme, brought all this to a head, and it was accepted, and that's where the country lost its innocence. Thank you.